agree that we think sustainable long-run economic growth derives from savings and investments and therefore increased productivity instead of borrowing and consumption. I know you well enough to know that we more or less agree with that, but do you measure the effects that these policies have on savers, on people living on fixed income, living, on CDs? Are you concerned at all about the very, very, very low interest payments that these savers are getting from these kinds of fixed income assets, which are hitting our savings and investment side of the economy in exchange for helping the borrowing and consumption side of the economy?
We are quite aware of that issue. We hear a lot about it. We consider it. We think about it. And I recognize that for people on a fixed income or whose main income is interest on a CD, I recognize that it imposes a hardship. The purpose of our policy, though, is to create a stronger economy, and savers collectively hold all the assets, all the capital in the economy. And if you don't have a strong economy, if you have a weak economy, you're not going to get good returns on all the other assets.
My time is running out. I just want to, let me give you just a sense of this. A lot of us believe that the Federal Reserve was too loose for too long in the 2003 to 2005 period. And that is what, in part, led to the asset bubble and the malinvestment that occurred and the problems we have today. I know you don't agree with that, but because you don't agree with that, our fear is that you're just going to repeat these same mistakes again, but by orders of magnitude that we can't even comprehend right now. And that the Federal Reserve, whose primary goal is to manage our money, is involving itself in fiscal policy, is sort of bailing out fiscal policy because the branch of government in charge of fiscal policy, this branch, is not doing its job. I mean, a budget hasn't passed Congress in 2 years. We're going to pass a budget. We did one last year, but it's not passed. There's nothing in the Senate. So fiscal policy isn't being done the way it needs to be done. But that's not an excuse for the Federal Reserve to step in and try and bail us out, because that could be done at the expense of the priority, which is unique to the Federal Reserve, of maintaining our currency as a reliable store of value. And we fear that these exercises and these new ambiguous statements will compromise that. That's the point I'm trying to make. Mr. Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Bernanke, thank you for your testimony. And you laid out what I think is a very clear two-track strategy for dealing with economic growth as we move forward. The first is recognizing the fiscal and budgetary challenge that we've got. And I think there's agreement on this committee that we need to come up with a predictable, stable way to reduce our deficits and debt. We've had disagreements over how we do it, but not whether we do it. And in looking at that, I think there are two lessons, I think, from what we see happening in Europe. One, of course, is the debt crisis, that if you wait too long to address these issues, you're right. Your borrowing costs are going to go up. People are going to lose faith. And we should heed that as an early warning and not delay putting in place those predictable changes. But your testimony also pointed out that there's a danger in overreacting to that in the near term in terms of the negative impact it could have on economic growth. And the other strategy that you've laid out is the need to nurture this very fragile economy we're in right now. So if you could just briefly talk about some of the lessons we've learned from the European experience, recognizing the debt crisis is an early warning system, but the austerity only and immediately approach, some countries can't avoid it, like Greece, because they've got themselves in a fix. But talk about the fact that a austerity only and immediate deep cuts, whether or not that can have a negative impact on the very fragile recovery that we're having now.
Well, the European situation is complicated. Among other things, of course, they have a monetary union and a fiscal disunion. They don't have the same kind of situation we have here. And you're correct also that there are some countries, like Greece, obviously, and others that have very difficult fiscal sustainability issues, and they have tried to address those in the near term. You know, I hesitate a bit to advise my colleagues in Europe, but I would cite the IMF and others that point out that very slow growth or recession makes fiscal improvement more difficult because tax revenues fall and spending automatically rises if there are social safety nets and the like. So it's important to try to figure out what the right balance is there. And I want to be very clear. I don't want anyone to interpret me as saying anything other than that this Congress has a very difficult and important job to address the long-term fiscal sustainability of our federal budget. That's a critical thing. I think that even more aggressive strategies than have been pursued recently are warranted over the longer term. But I also think that that can be done in a way which is persuasive to markets and achieves those objectives, but doesn't quite jolt the recovery quite, and it doesn't do it all, you know, all at once. I think that as long as there's a credible, strong plan over a period of time, and we move into that plan, that will achieve most of the objectives of fiscal sustainability, we need to at least avoid doing harm. I would say do no harm is an important piece of advice I would offer you. So there is a balancing act there that I think is important for us to pay attention to.
Thank you, Dr. Bernanke. And as you point out, those two goals are totally consistent. Sometimes they get muddled in the message, and I understand that sometimes people hear that, you know, interpret the need to prevent doing harm to the fragile economy now as meaning we shouldn't move ahead on long-term deficit reduction. Of course we should, as you said. You can do things at the same time, but if you undermine the fragile economy, as the IMF, as you indicated, has warned is being done with certain fiscal policies in Europe, that just creates an even bigger hole. And as I, again, apologize, have to leave to go to the conference on the payroll tax extension, if you could just comment on whether or not failure to extend the payroll tax cut for 160 million Americans and whether failure to extend unemployment compensation for millions of Americans who are out of work through no fault of their own, whether failure to do that would be a drag on what is already very fragile economic growth.
Congressman, I know you appreciate that I don't endorse individual tax and spending policies. I think that's a good approach for me to take. Obviously, you need to look at the whole picture. You know, I agree with what you said before, that you can't do one and not the other. You know, you can't say, well, we got to protect the recovery, and therefore we, you know, just completely put aside all of fiscal approaches to fiscal sustainability. You got to do both simultaneously, and you got to do both credibly. So I think it's the question of balance which is important.
Well, just to follow, as I look at your GDP numbers, your projected growth numbers, it seems pretty clear that they assume some extension of current policy, for example, an extension of some of the, at least through the end of the year, payroll tax cut. I'm not saying specific numbers, but there are differences between those and CBO, and CBO had to assume current law. They had to assume we don't extend the payroll tax cut, and they have to assume that all the tax cuts at the end of the year, including middle income tax cuts lapse. That's one of the reasons the CBO economic forecasts, GDP projections, are lower than yours.
Yeah.
So I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank my colleagues, and I'm going to
just yield the rest of the time to Mr. Doggett.
Yield the time, and I think he also has maybe a little time of his own as well. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yep. So just so members, he's leaving, so we're going to allow Mr. Doggett to finish his time, then we'll go back and forth. You hold the clock for him. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Doggett. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your testimony. Just continuing along the same line of questioning Mr. Van Hollen was raising, Chairman Ryan has expressed some concern that under certain circumstances, the Fed pursues a balanced approach. Do you believe that the Fed is having any difficulty in achieving the goals of both employment and price stability?
Well, I think it's evident that, particularly on the unemployment side, we'd like to see greater progress than we've seen. On the inflation side, I'm very cognizant of Chairman Ryan's concerns, but at least for now, we appear to be pretty close to target. I think what I would say about that is, of course, we're going to have to continue to evaluate monetary policy as the new data come in and as we see how the outlook changes and so on. But I've said before, and I think it's important to emphasize, that monetary policy can't do everything. It's not a panacea. And this body and others need to think about the troubled parts of the economy, places where improvements can be made, in the tax code or in other areas. And so, again, to answer your question, we're obviously not satisfied with where we are, and we look to, and while we will continue to do all we can to meet our dual mandate, which is what Congress has given us, we hope that that all of you and the administration and like will look for alternative ways to strengthen our economy.
And you certainly have the capacity to recommend to the Congress that it alter that mandate if you thought it was interfering with the objectives of the Fed.
I think it's been, the dual mandate has worked fine. It hasn't, we have as good an inflation record as any other central bank. I don't think it's been a major problem. So I think it's served us well. That being said, Congress created the Fed. Congress gave us our mandate. If you determine that you want to change it, we will, of course, do whatever you assign us to do.
And you, of course, determine how to implement that mandate. And you've said, with reference to price stability, a goal of about 2% is your goal. And with reference to unemployment, did I hear you say 4.5 to 6%? 5.2 to 6%?
The difference, Congressman, the difference between inflation and unemployment is that the Fed can control inflation in the long run. We cannot control unemployment in the long run. That's determined by many other factors in labor markets and other policies that we do not control. So we can't set an arbitrary target, but what we can do is try to make our best guess of where the economy, what level of unemployment the economy could sustain over a period of time. And we don't have an official number, but the 5.2 to 6% is the central tendency of the estimates provided by the members of the FOMC.
And while we would certainly be delighted to be at that range today or at the end of this year, that's still a substantial amount of unemployment, isn't it?
Certainly. We have a very high level of unemployment. We have not come remotely close to replacing the jobs that were lost in the recession. We have a very high level of long-term unemployment. I think we all agree that unemployment and underemployment and people leaving the labor force and all those things are a serious problem. I mean, we may disagree about remedies, but the problem is certainly there.
Right, and all I'm saying is that the objective that you've set in implementing the goal, I think I have another.
You'll have another 5 after Mr.
Oh, okay. Let me just finish then on this one point, that the objective you set is not an overly demanding objective as far as employment, the 5.2 to 6%.
We'll let you answer that in his next 5 minutes. Mr. Garrett, just to keep.
Sure.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So I heard your answer to Mr. Van Hollen before with regard, and you said, well, you normally don't like to give a comment on with regard to fiscal policy, in particular tax bills and the like. And I thought, really, Mr. Chairman? Is that still your opinion?
Yes, sir.
Because I was truly taken aback when just recently, as you know, the Fed issued an unsolicited white paper, if you will, on housing policy, where if you didn't advocate for it, you certainly mirrored much of the positions of this administration. So I don't know how the two go together. On the one hand, you say you don't get involved in these areas, but here you had a white paper that was not solicited from us. I know you're protective of your independence, but when you advocate for a position like that, why would you issue such a paper when we don't ask for it?
Well, Congressman, first, the Fed has a lot of interest in housing. It's important for the economy. It's important for monetary policy. We are bank supervisors, so we're interested in mortgage and lending and related
So let me
issues.
ask you this then. Congress has a lot of interest in monetary policy, I guess the comparable would be for us to do a House resolution with regard to monetary policy.